They buried this map 3 times. The Nolan Wells GPS files nobody was supposed to see. Before you do anything else, stop scrolling. Not because I'm trying to build suspense for the sake of it, but because what you're about to hear involves numbers, coordinates, timestamps down to the minute. And if your eyes glaze over during the boring part, you are going to miss the exact sentence where an entire alibi falls apart. This video has already been taken down twice. Not because it violated anything, not because it was inaccurate. It got taken down because someone, somewhere, didn't want you connecting these particular dots. So consider this the 3rd attempt, and consider yourself warned. The details in this one aren't the kind you catch while doing dishes or half watching from another room. Put the phone in your hand, turn the volume up, and actually pay attention, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why a grown woman with 0 law enforcement background has spent weeks of her own time laying satellite coordinates over a boat map, and why what she found in that overlay should be making a lot of powerful people in one small coastal town extremely uncomfortable. This is the Nolan Wells case. And this time, we're not starting with what his friends said happened. We're starting with what the GPS actually recorded.
The official report lists the vessel as a tide craft. The witness calls it a tide line. Those are not the same boat. That single sentence, buried in a 20-page navigation file, is where the entire official timeline begins to tear. But before we get to the boat that may not exist,
here's where things stop being about behavior and start becoming about hard physical contradiction. Throughout his entire interview, Warren refers to Bart's boat repeatedly, confidently, as a tide line. He says it over and over. He describes it with the kind of specificity that suggests real working knowledge of boats and brands. He claims that boat carried somewhere between 20 and 30 people, but the official report, the one that compiled GPS evidence from that day, lists Bart's boat not as a tide line, but as a tide craft. These are not interchangeable terms for the same thing. They are entirely different manufacturers, different hull designs, different intended purposes, different capacities. A tide craft is not built to comfortably carry 20 to 30 passengers. It's a fundamentally smaller class of vessel. So either Warren, someone clearly knowledgeable enough about boats to discuss trim angles, bilge systems, and battery placement in technical detail, simply misspoke the brand of his own close friend's boat repeatedly throughout an entire recorded interview, or there were 2 boats involved that day. One matching what Warren describes, one matching what the official report actually documents. Which raises the uncomfortable, unavoidable question, was there a 4th boat on the water that day that has never been publicly named, never been accounted for, and never appeared in any official account of that afternoon? Photographic evidence from that day allows for identification of 3 boats with reasonable confidence. The Triton, confirmed by a black stripe running across its white motor housing. Bart's boat, identifiable by a Garmin unit visible mounted on top. The Palm Beach, clearly labeled by name along its side, matching stripe pattern included. But in at least one surviving photograph, positioned on the opposite side of these 3 confirmed vessels, there's a visible black propeller with no matching name, no matching stripe pattern. Nothing tying it definitively to any of the 3 already identified boats. That single detail does not prove a 4th boat existed. Photographs distort. Angles mislead. Water reflections create visual noise that can look like almost anything if you stare at it long enough. But it is a physical, documented detail that does not cleanly resolve into the three-boat story that's been told publicly, and it deserves an explanation rather than silent dismissal.
We have to talk about the map. Not the map they gave the public, the map that refused to line up. Because when an independent researcher took the exact same GPS coordinates from the official report and dropped them into satellite imagery, the geography fought back. Islands that should lock into place drifted. A marina slid off its own foundation. Landmarks that have sat unmoved for years suddenly hovered in the wrong position. Think of it this way. You have a photograph of a room. You try to place furniture into that photograph so it matches the original. You line up the table, and the chairs float. You anchor the chairs, and the door is suddenly 3 feet left of where it should be. That is not a data error. That is a fingerprint of something being deliberately shifted. The researcher herself refuses to use the word fabricated. She is disciplined about that. She says only that clean data does not behave this way. And she is right. Clean data snaps into place. This data squirmed.
The map that wouldn't line up. There's a report out there, 20-some pages, compiled after this case went public, pulling together every documented movement of the boats involved in Nolan's disappearance. GPS points, plotted from the navigation system on one of the vessels involved, dropped straight into Google Earth, turned into slides, turned into a neat, official-looking presentation that got passed around as the timeline. And for a while, that was that. People had a map. People had dots on a screen showing where boats had supposedly gone. Case reasonably explained, right? Except an independent researcher, someone who's built a following doing exactly this kind of tedious, unglamorous data work, decided to take those same GPS points and lay them directly over her own separate research. Different source, different angle. Same physical geography, the same stretch of Mississippi coastline, the same islands, the same marina. It should have been simple. Anyone who's used Google Earth knows you can drop pins, overlay images, line things up in a matter of minutes if the underlying data is clean and accurate. It was not simple. It did not line up. She describes spending hours trying to get the islands to match, and once she finally got them positioned correctly, everything else around them refused to sit where it should. The marina drifted. The landmarks shifted. Things that shouldn't move, according to satellite imagery that's been stable for years, suddenly weren't sitting where the original report's slides claimed they were. Now she's careful here, and we're going to be careful too, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a lesser channel jumps straight to "the map was doctored" and runs with it as fact. She doesn't do that. She says plainly that her instinct tells her something was manipulated, that someone altered the image to obscure something. But she is upfront that this is a suspicion, not a proven fact. She cannot prove manipulation. What she can prove is that the overlay didn't behave the way a clean, unaltered data set should behave, and that discrepancy, whatever caused it, meant she had to rebuild the picture herself instead of trusting the version that had already been handed to the public. So she did the only thing left to do. She focused on what she could confirm: the marina, the grandparents' house where the group eventually docked, and she started following the boat's actual track, point by point, stop by stop. And the boat, once you actually follow where it went instead of where...
Before we go deeper into what the documents actually show, make sure you're subscribed to Beyond the Gavel File, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Here is what that evidence shows when you stop trusting the presentation and start tracing the actual points. The boat's path that day did not run a clean line back to safety. It hooked toward a specific marina. It curved into private docks. It slowed in places where no mechanical reason existed to slow.
The very first thing that jumps out when you trace this track is how close it runs to a specific marina, one connected to a man named Marty McGrath. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because it's the same name that surfaces in Katie McCormick's own account of that night, specifically regarding a ride home she says she caught. That alone might mean nothing. Marinas are public spaces. People catch rides from all kinds of acquaintances on a busy holiday weekend. But when you watch the boat's actual path, it doesn't just pass near this marina. It juts toward a dock in a way that looks, visually, like a vessel pulling up to make contact with land. Then it passes two more houses, and near one of them the track behaves exactly the same way, curving in toward a private dock, as though someone got dropped off or picked up. Then the boat runs south through a narrow lock area, all the way down to a bridge. Why would anyone run a boat all the way to a bridge only to turn back around? That question sat there unanswered until she looked at exactly what was sitting at that bridge, a large fishing pier. And immediately next to that pier, the Ocean Springs Yacht Club. That single detail changes how you have to read the rest of this map, because it turns out an uncomfortable number of the families connected to this case are tied, directly or through close friendships, to that same yacht club.
Then it stopped. 30 minutes. Motionless. At a location on El Camino Road. Not a minute. Not a rounding error. 30 minutes of silence, sandwiched.
Now we arrive at the detail that, once you understand it, changes how you have to read this entire case. The official report contains GPS timestamps tracking the boat's movement well after it left the island. Warren describes the run home as fast, somewhere around 40 to 42 miles an hour, specifically intended to force accumulated water out of the hull. He says the group didn't head straight to the grandparents' house, but instead detoured briefly into a waterway called Fort Bayou, where a couple of people jumped in specifically to put a drain plug back into place. That's the story, a quick, purely functional mechanical stop. But the actual GPS record tells a more complicated version. At 5:44, the vessel arrives at a location along a road called El Camino. 8 minutes later, it departs, heading east into Fort Bayou, which is at least broadly consistent with the plug story. 6 minutes after that, it returns to El Camino, and then it sits there for 30 minutes. Nothing in any interview, any public statement, or any account given so far addresses what happened during that 30-minute stop. It simply exists in the data, silent and unexplained, sandwiched directly between a documented 6-minute round trip into Fort Bayou and the boat's eventual departure towards St. Martin Bayou, then a bridge, before finally circling back to the boat launch and ultimately docking at a residence. 30 minutes is not a rounding error. It is not the kind of detail that slips someone's mind if their account of that evening is complete and accurate. 30 minutes sitting motionless at a specific documented location, immediately following a supposedly minor mechanical stop, demands its own explanation. And right now, there simply isn't one on record anywhere.
Between two documented movements, no one has ever explained that stop. Not in any interview, not in any statement, not in any official filing. The witnesses say the stop was to fix a drain plug. 6 minutes. But the GPS says something else. 6 minutes to fix the plug. Then 30 minutes of nothing. Then departure. That gap is where stories get rewritten.
Here's where Warren's account starts actively contradicting itself. Once the flooding is discovered, he says Wyatt jumps into the water and throws out a rear anchor. Stop and think about that for a second. If a boat is actively taking on water and at genuine risk, the very last thing you want to do is anchor it in place. An anchor holds a vessel exactly where it is. It does the opposite of moving toward safety. If your boat is sinking, the priority is getting to shore or getting immediate help, not securing your position in open water. Then Bart, driving a separate boat, offers to tow them. Again, if the danger was real and immediate, why would towing be the chosen solution, instead of simply evacuating everyone onto a boat that wasn't compromised and heading straight to shore? Why stay clustered together near shallow water instead of moving urgently toward safety? And the timeline itself contradicts what Warren describes. He says they left the island at 4:30, towed out roughly a quarter mile before the tow strap started rubbing against the hull, forcing them to stop and reposition. That's when, according to his account, Wyatt made a phone call. Not to 911, not to the Coast Guard, to a private towing company. And that call is documented as happening around 4 o'clock. Read those two claims back to back. He says they left the island at 4:30, but the call to the private tow company happened around 4. Either the stated departure time is wrong, or something about this entire sequence has been rearranged in the retelling. Either way, that is a direct internal contradiction coming from the same person in the same interview describing the same afternoon. Upstairs, talking about boats.
That gap is also where a question starts ticking. If this was just a mechanical problem, why does the timeline keep expanding? Why does a 45-minute water route exist when a 6-minute drive covers the same ground? Why does the security footage from that morning exist, but the footage from that night vanish? One camera works when they leave. The same camera is blind when they return.
Security cameras that only worked in the morning. The boat eventually docks that night at a residence belonging to the grandparents of a young man in the friend group, whose family has ties to a well-known local pharmacy. That property has security cameras. There is footage from that morning, capturing the group as they left to begin their day on the water. There is no footage from that night, capturing their return. If those cameras were functioning that morning, and nothing on record suggests they were disabled or malfunctioning by evening, why does footage capturing the single most important window of that entire night, the moment that would definitively confirm timing, presence, and whether Nolan actually returned with the group, simply not exist? That gap alone proves nothing conclusively. Systems fail. Storage gets overwritten. Cameras have blind spots nobody thinks to check. But in a case already layered with an unexplained 30-minute stop, mismatched boat identification, and a departure time that contradicts a documented phone call, a missing piece of footage covering precisely the most critical window of the night is not something that should be quietly waved away without a real answer.
That is not a coincidence. That is a selection. And here is the question that reframes everything. What happened in those 30 minutes that was so dangerous it required the geography itself to be altered after the fact? Not just the story, the geography. Because you can change a witness, you can pressure a friend, you can delay a report, but you cannot move an island unless you alter the map. The map was altered.
Here's where the independent research connects a thread that changes the entire shape of this story. The party referenced in that recording has a name attached to it now. A young woman, referred to here only as Ava, out of basic decency and to avoid publishing a private citizen's address. But simple public record searches, the same kind anyone with a browser and 20 minutes could do, are enough to locate her general location. And when you plot that location against the boat's GPS track, something clicks into place. After leaving the pier next to the yacht club, the boat's path hooks around and runs directly past the zone where that party was happening. Only after that does the boat finally come out of the water for the night. Look at what that actually implies. The route resembles a drop-off pattern, multiple stops, each one appearing to pull toward a dock or a private access point, consistent with dropping passengers at different locations before the boat itself gets put away for the evening. Not a direct single destination trip home. A circuit, a series of stops. And the families connected to this party are not strangers to one another. Katie's family, Wyatt's family, Warren's family, all documented through public photographs and social media as closely connected through that same yacht club community. These aren't casual acquaintances who happened to know each other from school. These are families who vacation together, who host joint celebrations together, whose kids have grown up in and out of each other's homes for years. There's a photograph from a joint birthday party earlier that same year, months before Nolan disappeared, that captures this connectivity in a single frame. Warren's mother is in it, his younger brother is in it, and standing in the background of that same photo, tagged in it directly, is a local elected official, the mayor of the town where much of this unfolded. On its own, a mayor showing up in a birthday photo proves absolutely nothing. Local officials attend community events. That's part of the job. But it tells you something important about scale. It tells you how small, how tightly wound, how socially interlocking this particular community actually is. And once you understand that, the next connection lands very differently.
That is the phrase you need to hold on to. The map was altered. And once you accept that, the rest of the case stops being a tragedy and starts being a structural failure.
Now let's step back and lay out the full sequence exactly as the friend group themselves described it, because their own words are where this story starts falling apart without any outside help. 3 boats were named as part of the group that day: a Palm Beach, a Triton, and a boat belonging to a friend named Bart. Warren, one of the more talkative members of the group in his recorded interview, said they arrived around 10:30 in the morning. But the GPS data shows the first waypoint wasn't dropped until 11:19, nearly 50 minutes off from the stated arrival time. He said all 3 boats anchored near each other. Around 3 o'clock, a fight broke out. According to Warren, it started because a stranger didn't like the way one of the younger members of the group was talking to his girlfriend. It became physical. Warren describes his uncle yelling for him to get into the boat, pulling him out of the confrontation. Separately, Warren says his younger brother was pulled into an entirely different altercation, punched, and responded by putting the other person in an arm bar. 2 separate fights, different people, same general window. On an island packed with holiday crowds, maybe that's plausible on its own. But it's the very next part of the story where things get genuinely strange. Because immediately after this fight, the boats start taking on water. A boat doesn't sink because people get wet. Warren's explanation is specific. He climbs onto the Triton and finds roughly 6 inches of water pooled near the transom, the flat rear section of the boat where the motor mounts. The bilge pump, the mechanical system whose entire job is removing exactly this kind of excess water automatically, isn't working. A friend is pulling debris out of the bilge, trying to get it functioning again. And his explanation for why the water accumulated in the first place is that too many people were climbing on and off the boat throughout the day, dragging water in with them. Anyone who has spent real time around boats will tell you immediately that this explanation does not hold up. Recreational vessels are not swamped through people entering and exiting from the water over the course of a few hours. That is not how hull buoyancy works, and it's not how these systems fail. Boats flood from waves coming over the side. They flood from operator error, specifically failing to properly trim the motor before accelerating. They flood from mechanical failures combined with rough conditions. And here's where Warren, without seeming to realize it, describes exactly that second scenario in his own words. He mentions popping open a side hatch and finding the battery completely submerged, which meant the motor's trim adjustment wouldn't respond properly. For anyone unfamiliar, trimming a motor angles the propeller relative to the boat, raising the bow so the hull can cut cleanly through choppy water instead of slamming into it. Fail to trim correctly, take off at speed anyway, and the boat can porpoise, smashing bow first into waves, taking water over the front, overheating, potentially stalling entirely. Warren himself admits the ride out that morning was calm, smooth water, light wind. But he also admits the ride back, immediately following the fight, was rough. Not dangerous by his account, but rough enough that his friends were, in his words, getting beaten up by the waves. Picture the full sequence now. Underage drinking all day, a physical fight just concluded, a reason to want to leave quickly, and a boat taking off at speed without properly adjusting its trim, immediately hitting choppy water on the way out. That is a completely coherent, physically plausible explanation for sudden flooding. It has nothing to do with people climbing in and out of the water. And once you accept that this is what actually happened, the entire sequence of events reorganizes itself. This wasn't a slow, calmly discovered mechanical issue. This looks like a rushed departure that went wrong.
Because the families in this story are not isolated. They are interlocked. A birthday photo from earlier that same year shows the mayor standing in the background. A missing person report names a lieutenant who shares a last name with a woman connected socially to the host of the party that night.
The very first name that appears on the official missing persons report, the officer who took the call when Nolan's mother reported him missing, is a lieutenant. Independent research has identified a woman connected to that lieutenant sharing the exact same last name, though the precise nature of that relationship hasn't been definitively pinned down. What has been confirmed through public information is that this woman is mutually connected through friendship to the mother of the young woman who hosted that night's party. That's it. That's the extent of what's actually confirmed. A shared last name and a mutual friendship, nothing more. But from that thin thread comes a theory, and it's presented explicitly as a theory, not a fact, not an accusation. The theory goes like this. What if the delay in reporting Nolan missing wasn't accidental confusion or slow-building concern, but a deliberate wait, timed specifically until the officer most likely to take that call, someone connected socially to this same tight community, would be the one on shift? If that theory holds even partially, it would explain several things that currently have no explanation at all. Why nobody was dispatched to search for Nolan that night. Why there's no footage of the group's actual return. Why not a single photograph from that supposed party has ever surfaced publicly, despite an entire house full of teenagers presumably having their phones out. Again, none of this is proof. It's a theory built from a coincidence of names and a documented mutual friendship. But in a case already full of unexplained gaps, that theory deserves to be tested, not dismissed, and definitely not ignored simply because it's uncomfortable.
A lawyer representing one side has a documented history with political advocacy groups funded by some of the wealthiest donors in the state. None of that is a crime, but it is a map. And that map has more sharp turns than straight lines. A grand jury is now impaneled. A phone remains unexamined in full public view. An autopsy remains sealed, even from the mother of the dead young man. The map was altered, and the silence around it is not accidental. It is architectural.
Now we move into territory that has nothing directly to do with what happened to Nolan on the water, but everything to do with understanding the environment this entire investigation is unfolding inside. The residence where the boat docked that night belongs to a family with a documented, multi-generational political history in the state. Records connect an earlier generation of that family to a former Mississippi governor whose administration, decades ago, was investigated for years over allegations of corruption and mismanagement, an administration that publicly supported maintaining racial segregation during its time in office. The governor himself was never personally convicted, but several of his aides and appointees were indicted over the course of that lengthy federal investigation. Separately, the attorney currently representing this family's side in ongoing defamation matters connected to this case has a documented professional history. State director of a prominent conservative political advocacy organization for several years, followed by a leadership role at an affiliated nonprofit. Both entities publicly and financially tied to a pair of extremely wealthy political donors whose funding has also flowed, documented and traceable, into other well-known conservative youth political organizations operating on college campuses. Now, we're going to slow down here, because this is exactly the moment where a less careful channel would start selling you a full-blown conspiracy. We're not doing that. A mayor appearing in the background of a birthday photo is not evidence of a cover-up. A lawyer's prior career is not a crime. A family's political history is not proof of anything regarding what actually happened to Nolan Wells. What all of this does establish, clearly and factually, is that these are not isolated, ordinary families navigating a private tragedy in a vacuum. These are families with real social, financial, and political weight in their community, roots that shape, whether through deliberate coordination or simple social gravity, how quickly problems get managed quietly, how effectively a narrative gets controlled, and how much institutional pressure can be applied behind the scenes when something threatens to become a genuine public liability. That context doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it absolutely helps explain why this case has moved as slowly and as carefully as it has. What this actually proves and what it doesn't. None of what's been laid out here proves how Nolan Wells died. None of it names a killer. Nobody in this video is making an accusation of murder. What it proves is narrower and in some ways more important than a single dramatic accusation would be. The timeline told by the friend group is not settled. It contradicts itself internally on basic details like departure times and boat identification. The boat's actual GPS track includes a 30-minute stop that has never been addressed. A fourth vessel may exist that nobody has formally accounted for. And the people at the center of this story are woven into a small, tightly connected, socially and politically powerful community that has every structural reason to control how this narrative gets told. That is not a verdict. That is a map. And right now, that map has more unexplained turns on it than straight lines. The grand jury process connected to this case is ongoing. That alone tells you something, because prosecutors don't typically bring cases in front of a grand jury when the evidence overwhelmingly points toward a simple, tragic accident with no further questions attached. A grand jury doesn't decide guilt. It decides whether there's enough evidence to justify moving forward with formal charges at all. The fact that this case is sitting in front of one means someone with access to far more information than any of us currently believes there's a real possibility worth examining. Nolan's cell phone, as far as anyone outside this investigation currently knows, has still not been fully, transparently, forensically examined and shared with the public. That phone could theoretically answer nearly every question raised in this video within days, if it were properly analyzed. The fact that it hasn't been, or that results haven't been shared if it has, remains one of the loudest silences in this entire case. The official state autopsy remains sealed, not released publicly, reportedly not even fully shared with Nolan's own family in complete detail. Think about how genuinely strange that is. A mother who lost her son does not have full access to the official government findings about how he died. That is not normal. That is not acceptable. And it is exactly the kind of institutional silence that
So
breeds...
here is the call to research. Pull the official incident report filed in Jackson County. Look at the vessel identification line. Look at the timestamps. Then overlay them yourself on any public satellite tool. You do not need to be a forensic analyst to see what the researchers saw. You just need to look. And when you do, answer one question in the comments. What innocent explanation exists for a map that refuses to sit still? Because right now, after 3 attempts to bury this file, nobody has offered one.
What happens next? If you're following this case, subscribe now, because there's more coming. There's still the question of the voicemail, unauthenticated but disturbingly consistent with the GPS data. There's still the question of the fourth boat, hinted at through mismatched terminology and an unidentified propeller in a single photograph. There's still the question of the political connections running underneath this entire community and how far those connections actually extend into how this investigation has been handled from the very beginning. Leave a comment below telling us which thread you think deserves the most attention next: the voicemail, the fourth boat, or the political web tying these families together. Because Nolan's family is still waiting for real answers, and the very least any of us can do is keep asking the questions nobody in an official position seems willing to ask out loud. And if you have any real information about that 30-minute stop, about the missing return footage, about who was actually driving that Palm Beach, or about anything else connected to what actually happened on Horn Island that day, there are active efforts through independent investigators and through the family's own legal team offering meaningful rewards for verified, credible tips that move this case forward. If you know something,
If this video raised questions you have been asking yourself, like it, share it, subscribe to Beyond the Gavel file, and turn on notifications. Because the next file is already open, and it is worse.